hundreds of thousands of people, CCTV, there's a national command centre that are watching all of the CCTV, there are helicopters, it's an extremely complex policing operation. But the important thing for me, and the thing I've been talking about in the press this week, since the meeting I was at Downing Street on Wednesday, is that this has cost already £25 million. The Met can ill afford to spend that money.
Do you have faith that there aren't any other Wayne Cousinses around the country right now?
Well, I cannot give you that assurance, Kate, unfortunately, and I really wish I could. But do I think that we have people like him? Am I having sleepless nights that we have people like him in policing? No, I'm not. I mean, he's a monster. He was a very, very depraved person. The most important thing for me, because you will always have bad people in any profession, is making sure that the safety nets are there to catch them and to stop them from being in that very privileged position of carrying a warrant card. Now, what we have got in policing is some good processes. The problem is the processes were not being adhered to properly, and things were being overlooked. So, for example, when Wayne Couzens originally was vetted to become a special constable going into the Kent Constabulary, I think it was back in 2002 to 2010, he served as both a member of the Territorial Army and the Kent Special Constabulary. Then it was actually in 2011, and he worked there in 2018, he went to the Civil Nuclear Constabulary. There were opportunities missed in both of those vetting processes. Then when he transferred to the Metropolitan Police in 2018, because he'd already been vetted by two other police organisations, I think the Met assumed that he had passed vetting, and therefore they did do checks, but they weren't as thorough as they could have been. And then he was put forward for developed vetting during his policing career as well, which is the highest level of vetting that you can have in the country, when he was working at the Civil Nuclear Division. So there were the processes are there, they're there to catch people and keep people safe, but the processes were not adhered to properly. And that's really what the learning point is that's coming out of this.
Yes, and what commitment or legal force do we have to say that this report's going to be acted on, and that police forces and the multiplicity of police forces, as you've just outlined, are actually going to improve their procedures and, make things very simple, like actually accurately recording incidents of people exposing themselves, which repeatedly didn't happen in Couzens' case. I mean, what's going to make them do it? I mean, it's all very well knocking the stable door after this terrible tragedy, but is there any legal force behind these recommendations?
Well, that is a really good point, Adam. And you mentioned the number of indecent exposures, and these weren't just exposures. They were very, very decent. They were on the most lewd, scale of what you could get in terms of what Couzens was doing, literally up until days before he abducted, raped and murdered poor Sarah. And so, yes, you're right. Those offences were not recorded as they should have done. And not only that, they weren't acted on as they should have done. So in answer to your question, is there assurance? Can I give you assurance that these things will be acted upon, that Lady Angelini's report and recommendation will be taken seriously? Absolutely. It is ultimately being commissioned by the Home Office through the previous Home Secretary. This report will be going back to the current Home Secretary, James Cleverly. He received that last week. Now, he will be, in his role as Home Secretary, with the powers that he has, in communication with police and crime commissioners and with their chief constables to say, this is what I expect to happen, this is what must happen. And there are safety nets and safeguards to make sure that the Home Office, through the College of Policing, can make sure that these things are being implemented.
I want to turn to policing protests because we don't have huge amounts of time. The Prime Minister does seem to be pushing for the police to be tougher on protesters. I understand that you were in the meeting where he met with policing figures. What was his sort of message? What was the tone of that meeting from your perspective?
Yes, well, as you've seen from the statements that have come out of the meeting from Number 10 last Wednesday, and you're right, I was there with 4 or 5 chief constables, the Metropolitan Police, National Counter-Terrorism Commander, National Chris Noble, Chief Constable, who is the National Protest Lead, as well as the Home Secretary, the Security Minister, Tom Tugendhat, as well, and the Policing Minister, Chris Philp. And the Home Secretary made it very clear, the Prime Minister made it very clear, that he wanted to see firmer action. Clearly, see the projection of images onto Big Ben, such as from the river to the sea, caused deep offence and were clearly meant to do that. That was very much the intention of the group that set up that projection onto Big Ben. That is it's appalling that that was able to happen.
Why, Donna, just forgive me for interrupting. Why wasn't that stopped? Because police were in Parliament Square. They could see the projector, which was projecting that onto Big Ben, Elizabeth Tower, and they didn't stop it. Why didn't they?
Well, that is a very good point. And it was actually projecting for 14 minutes. And actually, that wasn't the first building in London that it happened to. It started actually at the law courts, I think 45 minutes to an hour beforehand, at the Courts of Justice, and it worked its way through London. So yes, good point. Why wasn't that taken down sooner? And that's exactly the point the Prime Minister was making, as well as, what happened with Tower Bridge. It's not acceptable that Tower Bridge was closed for almost an hour.
And what was the answer in that meeting? What was the answer that the Prime Minister got when he put that question? What was the response from those in charge?
Well, I'm not at liberty to share the specifics that were discussed in the meeting itself in terms of people's response. That is really for them to give that answer. But it's safe to say the Prime Minister made his position very clear about how he's not happy about what happened. He wants to see quicker, more responsive action. Bridges, public roads through the capital cannot be closed for that period of time. The key point here is the police are saying they've got the powers they need. The law is there to support them to do what they need to do. Well, he is saying, well, get on and use those powers then, and don't let this happen again. It's not acceptable. And I suspect we may well have more meetings like this in the future as well.
And so the reason for police not doing that so far has been what?
Well, I think and again, I'm not a spokesman for the Met here. I am,
of course,
the National Chair of Police and Crime Commissioners, but I will give you my take on that. When you are policing protests of upwards of sort of 300,000-400,000 people, it is a pressure cooker. Affirmative action on something which may seem fairly minor to the public can cause a chaos to break out. And I think what the Met Police are trying to do is to balance all of this. But of course, the Prime Minister's point is that, OK, I know you don't want to be overly heavy-handed in arresting people because of the projection of an image onto Big Ben or for chanting, slogans, those sorts of things. However, you have to be able to balance this with the right of the everyday person going about their business in London. They have a right to go about their business in London without having roads closed, bridges closed, or deep offence being caused to Jewish people or anyone else who's walking past Parliament building and seeing slogans projected onto it. So, yeah.
Do you think that some people, a small minority of those in these protests, want the police to be heavy-handed? Do you think they are seeking that kind of confrontation?
Yes, undoubtedly. I think we know that there are things that are done to try and provoke the police and push the limits as far as they can. These groups are very clever at knowing there are certain flags which are absolutely lawful. There are certain flags, and there are very, very subtle differences to a Palestinian flag versus a flag that is inciting, for example, and promoting Hamas, who are a recognized terrorist organization. And so things like people having the parachuters on their rucksacks as they were walking around in the very early protests after the 7th of October attack. There are small bits, hundreds of thousands of people, CCTV, there's a national command centre that are watching all of the CCTV, there are helicopters, it's an extremely complex policing operation. But the important thing for me, and the thing I've been talking about in the press this week since the meeting I was at Downing Street on Wednesday, is that this has cost already £25 million. The Met can ill afford to spend that money, and importantly, the thousands of police officers that are working every month on policing these protests when they should be out catching people who are committing drug offences, knife offences, sexual violence, domestic violence. That's what the Met should and want to be doing. And actually, this is wholly irresponsible. We get the point the protesters are making. We get they want the ceasefire. We get their message. Everyone's heard it. The British public cannot be aware of it, but now enough is enough, and we need to allow the Met Police to focus back on the priorities that Londoners and the rest of us want them to.
So does the police need more money in the budget this week? Is that what you want to see from the Chancellor?
No, I think there are some other tweaks that are being considered, such as whether or not they should have to give a 14-day notice to be able to carry out one of these protests. And there are a few other tweaks that the Attorney General, she was in the meeting as well. The Attorney General is currently considering with the Home Secretary and the Policing Minister and Tom Tugendhat, the Security Minister. So watch this space. I think there could be some further tweaks coming forward.
I just want to end on kind of your own personal perspective, if you like, because we're going to be speaking to Vanessa Lee next, who's been chosen as a Tory candidate. She's got a very sort of worrying experience, if you like, of what she's had directed at her in terms of abuse and hate since she was selected. You are obviously a public figure. I mean, have you had any experiences of this kind of hatred directed towards you, any threats against you? How concerned are you about that kind of thing in public life?
Yes, I have. I've been a politician now for over 15 years. And I have had, when I was selected as the Police and Crime Commissioner, Conservative Police and Crime Commissioner for Hampshire and the Isle of Wight, I had somebody turn up at my house at 1:10 in the morning, bashing on the front door, trying to pick my door lock. He had bottles of bleach. He had empty glass ale bottles that were smashed. He had significant mental health issues, I found out afterwards. He wasn't known to me beforehand. He was arrested on my driveway, but that was then a few weeks later proved to have been politically motivated, and also he was obsessed by the police. I've had somebody turn up at my house and drive a sort of 5-foot white arrow on my driveway, draw it on my driveway, right in front of the room I'm sat in now, actually in my study. And I had someone just 2 weeks ago phone my office and threaten to kill a police officer. Now, the incidents that have happened to me, whilst they sound alarming to the public, are actually minor in comparison to what members of parliament are currently getting, and parliamentary candidates. Some of the things that members of parliament are going through, particularly, for example, members of parliament not being able to go back to their home, as we saw a couple of weeks ago, and not being able to take their children back to their property, advised by the police not to do that because of protesters outside their home. It's really, really worrying, and more does need to be done.
Should we ban protests outside politicians' houses?
Yes, I mean, I think it's not about banning them. I think that the law is already there. It's under the Harassment Act, and the police just need to be enforcing it. They already have the powers to do what they needed to do in that incident with Tobias Ellwood's house. And unfortunately, they didn't really manage that very well at all. But there are learning points that have come from that. But I am, I'm concerned for members of parliament at the moment. I'm concerned with some of my friends, my colleagues from both of the main political parties, and of course the Liberal Democrats. This is, I don't want to see any Lib Dem, Labour, Green Party, any candidate have to go through what's going on. It's not acceptable, and we do need to see some firm action to stop it from being repeated.